Hello and welcome to BBC World News. For some, it feels like a rerun of the Cold War. The US and Russia at a diplomatic standoff, their military assets standing by. After months of escalating tensions and less than a decade after Russia annexed Crimea, the two superpowers have been holding talks about Ukraine, which NATO fears is the next sovereign territory Moscow wants to seize through force. Russia says it is concerned that NATO is sending weapons and military expertise to Ukraine and wants guarantees that the organisation will pull back from its borders. But speaking after the talks, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the dialogue would continue and that his country had no plans to attack Ukraine. Russia is understood to have more than 100,000 troops currently near its border with Ukraine and has also sent forces to take part in what it says are military exercises in neighbouring Belarus. Several NATO countries have sent advisors to help train Ukrainian forces and also provided logistical support. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams sent this report.
Russian surface-to-air missiles on the move in the country's far east, due to join what Russia calls military drills close to Ukraine next month. Part of an invasion plan or merely Russia visibly piling on the pressure? The atmosphere in Geneva is febrile. The stakes couldn't be higher or the mood less optimistic. If the greetings seemed awkward, well, that's hardly surprising.
Is an invasion likely, as President Biden suggested?
Unless the United States does.
Mr. Lavrov seems to suggest it's up to the United States. And then, after a meeting that lasted just an hour and a half, tentative signs that diplomacy is not over. Talks, Mr. Lavrov said, had been open and useful.
This is not the end of our dialogue, as I said. And next week, as Secretary Blinken has said on many occasions, we will get a written reaction to our initiative.
Mr. Blinken says he'll share America's concerns and ideas in more detail next week. But
we've been clear. If any Russian military forces move across Ukraine's border, that's a renewed invasion. It will be met with swift, severe, and a united response from the United States and our partners and allies.
Fresh satellite images show Russia still massing men and equipment at strategic locations. American officials have said an attack of some kind could come soon. But diplomats haven't lost hope.
We still believe that there is a slight possibility that the catastrophe can be averted. And that's what our American colleagues did, what UK's colleagues are doing, the Europeans, trying to persuade him that there is still a way to avoid a catastrophic war.
But if it does come to a fight, Ukraine says it's better prepared than before, releasing these pictures yesterday to drive home the point. The country's allies telling Russia not to expect a walkover.
Ukrainians will fight this. This could end up as a quagmire, and I think that should be seriously considered by Russia.
For now, Russia appears to believe there's still value in talking. Mr. Lavrov said he hoped emotions would now cool. But the gulf which divides the two sides is still immense.
The Russians have made very high-level demands, calling for NATO to pull back to 1997 borders, to never extend the option for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO, and for the United States to pull back its nuclear commitment to Europe. This is clearly unacceptable.
Geneva's windswept lakeside has now been the backdrop for 2 rounds of high-level diplomacy. Is there now a process that can avert conflict? It's too early to say. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Well, let's speak to our correspondents, Caroline Davis, who's in Moscow, and Barbara Pletasha, who joins us from Washington. Caroline, can I start with you? How is this being seen in Moscow in terms of achievements or otherwise?
Tim, I think it's still relatively early days, and no one is saying that this has been some sort of solution, that everything has been resolved by the course of the talks today. And in fact, both sides said before they began the talks that they weren't expecting to have any major breakthroughs. This was not about a negotiation. This was, in Secretary Blinken's words, a candid exchange of ideas, and that was the intention behind it, for both sides to get a better understanding of what the other wanted. Now, we've heard from, in the course of the report, that it sounds like there was some language language that was potentially encouraging. So Secretary Blinken talked about a spirit of reciprocity, and Minister Lavrov talked about open and useful conversations. But at the same time, you should bear in mind that almost in the same breath, both sides were keen to talk about the fact that they still view the other side as an aggressor, that there are still issues on the table, that this has definitely not been resolved. So at the moment, this is still very much hanging in the balance.
Barbara, has today cleared up some of the confusion, perhaps, that we saw in the aftermath of President Biden's press conference about this issue just a couple of days ago?
Well, I think Mr. Blinken, again, you heard his comment there that any incursion, any movement of Russian troops over the border would be considered a major incursion and would get a swift and severe response. The White House also has been saying the same thing. This because of Mr. Biden's comments during his Wednesday press conference, in which he said if there was a minor incursion, then NATO could well be split on how to respond, and it would be much easier to have a united response if it was a major incursion. So they've defined it as as Russian soldiers moving across the border. But that doesn't take away the possibility that there might be a Russian action that falls short of such a military move. There could be a major cyber attack. There could be reinforcements to the pro-Russian separatists in the eastern of the country. Then I think it's a reality that it would be more problematic for NATO to agree on the level of sanctions to respond with, and even the level of support to Ukraine.
Barbara, just one further one for you. I mean, Blinken said that they would be providing written answers to Russia's demands, but is there any sense at all that NATO would capitulate to the withdrawing, for example, of forces on those eastern borders of NATO?
No, in answer to your question, there is no sign at all, at least publicly, that the NATO and the US are willing to give on Russia's key demands. And there's no sign at all that Russia is willing to give either. So there's been no change in the substance of the standoff. I don't think that's a surprise. That was being signaled very much by both sides, that this was not going to be resolved, that these talks, that there wouldn't be a breakthrough. What we have seen is that they have agreed to keep talking. So this announcement by the Americans that they would respond in writing to Russia's demands, which is what Moscow has really been pressing for, was the action that came out of these talks, and that will set the stage for further discussions, for another meeting. But there's no sign that Russia is interested in what the U.S. wants to talk about, which is far less proposals such as dealing with missile deployments and military exercises, trying to address Russia's security concerns by increasing transparency and communications about those things. That will probably be part of the written response. It is interesting that the talks that will continue are between Russia and the U.S. NATO had also put forward a proposal for talks on those grounds, but the Russians seem to be more interested in speaking directly to the United States at this point.
OK, Caroline, final one for you, because what nobody should forget, of course, is that there's been a low-level war in the east of Ukraine since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea. Thousands of people have died. I think 13,000 people have died in the intervening years. Moscow and Russia, of course, has also handed out hundreds of thousands of passports to people there. And I just wonder if that is a key PR spin point that the Kremlin is using, saying that these are Russian citizens in Ukraine.
I think one point that's quite interesting to raise at the moment, Tim, is the fact that we heard from the Communist Party, who have put forward this proposal for the occupied areas in eastern Ukraine to be recognised by Russia as independent states. And part of that proposal was saying that if those states were potentially considered to be under threat, that would be a useful thing to be able for Russia to be able to acknowledge them. Now, some analysts have suggested, could that be a way for Russia to justify some form of action to be able to sort of say, well, we are now operating, we are recognising these states, so therefore if there's any sort of military action that we feel like we need to step in, Potentially, but at the moment we've also heard from the Kremlin earlier today suggesting that this was a very delicate situation and perhaps not the moment to be talking about this. This has not come from the Kremlin; it's come from the Communist Party separately. So clearly, this is a sort of ongoing issue, and exactly the tensions that are happening in Ukraine at the moment. We don't know what the Kremlin's next move will be.
OK, Caroline and Barbara, thank you both very much indeed.